Hello, and welcome to the Alternate History Class Podcast. My name is Andrew, and here I explore alternate history through the lens of a history class from an alternate timeline. Last week, we took a quick look at how the Battle of Antietam changed the course of the American Civil War. This week, we'll look at how Lee could have won the war, and what the peace treaty looks like in this alternate history. Alright class, let's get started. Today we will be continuing our look at the War of Secession. Now several of you seem to be upset when I called it the War of Secession, but that is what it is officially called by the majority of countries around the world. Some of you who grew up in the South may know it by a different name, but we will look at that perhaps some other time. In this class, we will be calling it the War of Secession. Now, last time, we looked at the disastrous Peninsular Campaign, in which McClellan attempted to attack Richmond from the south, a doomed attempt that would cause him to retreat and take his Army of the Potomac back to Washington, D.C. He would soon move his army to have its new headquarters in Frederick, Maryland, upon getting news that Lee had also decided to move west. Now, this is when Lee began what he simply called the Maryland Campaign, but what many historians have decided to call the final campaign, because of how it ended the war. Now, the two major highlights of this are the raid of Pittsburgh on September 18th of 1862, when Wade Hampton led several brigades to raid the munitions factories and the such around the city of Pittsburgh. This caused uproar throughout the northern states and caused the Confederacy a major victory in the eyes of the observing nations. Lincoln was enraged by McClellan for not having the foresight to stop this. So McClellan began to move north to try to cut Lee off, because it had been widely known that Lee was now gathering his forces at the small Pennsylvania town of Bedford to move on the capital of the United States to try to force an end to the war. This would result in the Battle of Bedford on October 20th of 1862. Now, this is the single bloodiest day of the war, resulting in approximately 25,000 casualties, mostly on the Union side. And this is because Lee used his terrain and his time that McClellan gave him by slowly, carefully maneuvering his forces to Bedford to set up a trap for the Union's top general. This would result in a rout that essentially broke the Union Army that fled all the way back to Washington, D.C. Now, Lee would pursue this and had every intention of continuing his march to Washington when, as Lee crossed back into Maryland on the other side of the Appalachians, the pro-secessionist forces in Maryland felt a renewed sense of right. They saw that this was their opportunity to do what they had tried to do ever since the election of Abraham Lincoln. And they overthrew the government in Annapolis. Their leader, Richard Spriggs Stewart, would declare himself governor. And before Lee could march on Annapolis, he decided to go and quickly siege down Baltimore to hold the Union Army that was holding the city from the capital of the self-declared secessionist state. Now, all of this led to the United Kingdom and France finally recognizing the Confederate States. Now, some of you may be wondering why those nations who had long outlawed slavery would recognize a country that was formed to defend slavery. And that simply comes down to the fact that the South was the major provider of cotton for the factories, for the textile factories in the United Kingdom and France. They wanted the cotton to flow, and the Union blockade on the Confederacy had stopped that flow. So upon their recognition on November 3rd of 1862, they set the grounds for what they would do only 2 days later, and have their ambassadors pressure President Lincoln into an armistice to end the conflict and end up recognizing the Confederacy. And it would be on that November 5th date that an armistice would be officially called for by the Union and accepted by the Confederacy. And the United States and Confederacy would send ambassadors over to the United Kingdom to discuss the treaties. These talks would begin on November 14th of 1862, and we're going relatively well. And we're really scheduled to wrap up when on July 4th of the next year, in 1863, Kentucky declared that it wanted to join the Confederacy, which would set back talks for another several months as they worked out what to do about the Kentucky question, as it was called. But all in all, the Treaty of London would be agreed to on January 8th, 1864. Now, the Treaty of London did several things. Its first and most obvious thing was have the United States recognize the Confederacy's independence. It would also recognize Kentucky and Tennessee, where most of the Union's success in the war had come, as part of the Confederate States. Maryland would be divided between East and West. The East would be called Maryland, maintaining that name and recognizing the government that had overthrown the pro-Union government, while the pro-Union government would take the western part of the state, called Allegheny. Now, the U.S. would also have to, in this case, cede Washington, D.C., which it didn't really want to hold on to while it was surrounded by a foreign nation. And the CSA would pay $3 million as compensation. The United States agreed to pay the CSA a total of $20 million in reparations over the next 20 years in even $1 million installments, while the CSA would gain the Oklahoma Territory, something that was another hot disputed point. What it did to gain it was forfeiting any claims it had to the Arizona and New Mexico territories. The Confederacy also volunteered in order to get Oklahoma, because this was a major sticking point, as well as along with Kentucky. The state of West Virginia would be recognized as a Union state. Now there came one more key point, that the two nations now shared the Mississippi River, and it was a major shipping lane for the United States before the war. So the Confederacy in this treaty began a lease on several docks within the port for U.S. shipping. And that would last for 20 years. And this part of the treaty was designed as a contract that could be renewed every 20 years and needed to be every 20 years. Now, this whole debacle in the War of Secession had ruined Lincoln's reputation. And while Lincoln is not remembered as a good president, or even by many a competent president, he was a very wise politician. No one can deny that without being foolish. And so on January 4th of 1864, 4 days before the ambassadors agreed to the treaty, Lincoln announced that he would voluntarily not run for a second term, which meant that the Republicans would have to quickly scramble to find a nominee. Now, as for the treaty, it would quickly be ratified by the Confederate Congress on February 9th, 1864, which would become a federal holiday as the Confederate Independence Day. While it would get stuck in the U.S. Congress for several more months. The United States Congress was vastly controlled by Republicans before the loss in 1862. But with Democratic sweeps, the House and Senate were much more even at this point. And so the Democrats, who wanted to recognize the treaty, to end the war, to promote peace, were stuck. They didn't have the votes themselves. So on June 13th, 1864, the United States Congress came to an agreement as the treaty was ratified in a political deal that guaranteed the passage of what would become the 13th Amendment through Congress, an amendment that would easily pass in the North, that would abolish slavery. Now, when it came to the presidency, the Republicans had absolutely no shot that November. At their convention in August of 1864, the Democrats nominated longtime politician and stalwart in New York, Horatio Seymour, as their presidential candidate, he ran with Augustus C. Dodge, while the Republicans had, back in June, decided to nominate the Secretary of State, William Seward, for president and Salmon P. Chase for the vice presidency. The Democrats handily defeated the Republicans in November of 1864 and fully took control of the House and Senate, meaning they could pass any legislation that they viewed fit to carry out the agreement that they made with the Republicans on the 13th Amendment. Meanwhile, in the Confederate States, Robert Lee was the hero. He was the Confederate George Washington. People were begging him to run in 1864 to become the Confederacy's president. But Lee, not wanting to get involved in politics, decided to instead endorse Jefferson Davis to become the first president of the now independent Confederacy. He had been serving in the role and would continue to serve in the role as he ran unopposed, as having the backing of Lee, having Lee on his side, was an absolute killer for anyone else who had any ambitions at the Confederate presidency. Now, this will be where we end our class for today. But next week, we will be looking at how the United States responded to losing a war that logistically, they realistically should have won. But they just got out-tacticked by the Confederacy. Now, I know we're a little early, but I don't think anyone's going to be upset by me letting out class early today. You're dismissed. Thank you for checking out the alternate history class on YouTube. If you enjoyed this week's episode, feel free to like the video, and if you want to see each video when it goes live, subscribe and hit that bell. The alternate history class can be found on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, or wherever you find podcasts. A big thank you to my patrons. If you'd like to support the show, you become a patron, and if you're in the top 2 tiers, you'll get a shout out at the end of each episode after you sign up. Thank you for your most important donation, your time, and I'll see you next time as we journey down the path not taken.